And here we are live. Hey, good morning or good evening, wherever you are, and thank you all very much for joining today. My name's Daniel Palmer. I'm the co-founder and head of client engagement for Remobi, and I'm delighted to be joined by Henry Poydar, and this is in conversation with Remobi. With over 25 years of experience in the industry and the current CEO of Steady, an AI async coordination platform, today we'll be diving into the principles and the framework of continuous coordination. Here at Remobi, we build remote-first nearshore technology teams across the globe. As many of you will know, building and leading distributed teams can offer a ton of opportunities, but it also comes with a lot of its own unique challenges. And hopefully today we can explore some of those in this webinar and gain more insight specifically into continuous coordination with Henry's great insights. Towards the end, there'll be an opportunity for question and answer. So please feel free to save your questions for the end, or if you'd like to interact throughout, feel free, pop your question in the chat and I can ask Henry as we go along. So yeah, without further ado, Henry, I'll pass over to you and let's get going.
All right. Well, it's great to be here, Daniel, and thanks for that nice introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a lightweight web framework called, not web framework, process framework called continuous coordination. Just make sure my screen is being shared. There we go. And I'm going to talk for about 20, 30 minutes about the principles of a continuous coordination, where it came from, the origins, and then leave time for questions towards the end. So as Daniel said, I'm Henry Poydar. I've got 25 years in engineering and digital products. I've been a developer, I've been a team lead, I've been a consultant, I've been a CTO, I've been a VP of engineering, and I've done it across startups and across management consulting companies and public companies, but mostly at startups. And currently I'm the founder and CEO of Steady, which we can talk about at the end. And then we've got Daniel, of course, co-founder of Remobi, and he already gave his lovely introduction. So I'm going to start with a premise, and the premise is that COVID and the pandemic changed all of the fundamental work variables, but that we're still using the same processes for work. And I'm going to give an example about that. I have a close friend of mine who works at a big bank, and they were, of course, all in office pre-COVID. And then when the lockdowns came, they all went remote, and they stayed that way for about 1.5 years. And then they started coming back into the office, and now they are full remote, full 5 days RTO back in the office. And I asked him what was the difference between how people were working before in the office and then now how they're working afterwards. And his answer to me was very telling. He said, well, Henry, before the pandemic, the whiteboards and the conference rooms in our office were always full. The whiteboards were full of stuff, of drawings, of collaborative notes, of diagrams, of sketches, of meeting notes. The conference rooms were full of people, and there was just energy around the office. And today we're all back in the office, but the whiteboards are pristine. The whiteboards are empty. The conference rooms are empty. And the moral of the story there is people got used to working in remote and async ways during the pandemic. And so even though they're coming back to the office and sitting next to each other, they're still working with these ways that got that have fundamentally changed. They're still on Zoom calls. They're still doing async communication. And so we're still using processes that are pre-pandemic, but the way that we've worked has changed, and that's illustrated by this story. So, here. So here we are today in modern work, and the point of that story is that even if you're all in the office, the way we're working is in a distributed manner. So there's really not many teams left who have no dependencies with other people who are not on other schedules or other geographic or in other geographic locations. So there's an equation of work where things like place where work got done and time when work got done were constants, but in that formula now, those things are variable. And so we have to figure that out. So that's one piece about modern work. Now it is permanently distributed after the pandemic. The other piece is that modern work requires context. And what I mean by that is, we have AI, we have automation, we have tons and tons of tools. And so what that means is that developers and other knowledge workers are being increasingly relied on to make decisions. That is really the fundamental piece of work that a developer, a designer, a marketing person or any other domain teammate is doing during the day. They're making decisions, what code to write, what library to use, what dependency to incorporate, what compliance rules they need to follow. And so all of that decision-making that happens hundreds and hundreds of times per day for every single person on any given team, particularly software product teams, requires context in order for that to work. So those are two pieces, I think, fundamental, important tenets of modern work: distribution and requiring context. So let me move my slides here. The problem with that is that we've over-engineered modern work. And so in order to get that context that someone needs, or a manager needs, or a developer needs, or an architect needs, we're asking those people to reach into multiple silos of information, of data, of knowledge, of context in order to get the information and the context they need to make those important decisions and get work done. And we have frameworks. We have, for example, Agile, which is a great framework, but was really designed around a small group of people sitting in the same room together. And again, we've just talked about that's not really the reality of modern work. It's not the way people work together, and it's just really not the reality because work is distributed. And so that process is overwhelming, and it's people are spending all kinds of times trying to gather that context because they need to do it. So they're encountering all kinds of coordination overhead. They're in meetings. They are tapping people in Slack. They're tapping people literally on the shoulder. They're trying to extract this context constantly that they need to make these decisions. And it's complicated, it's overwhelming. And what happens is you spend all your time on this coordination overhead, and you spend not a lot of time actually doing the work. And there's another consequence to that too, is that there's no single source of truth for that context. So you have information silos. You might have something like a Notion or a Confluence. You might have a meeting where there are some notes. You might have some PRD document, whatever it might be. But all of these things represent multiple contexts. And so as a person on the ground who's making these decisions to get work done, it's confusing, and you end up with these multiple sources of truth. And of course, you end up with multiple outcomes, multiple outputs for the work that's required. And sometimes that's a little impact, like you lose a day, or you have to rewrite a piece of code. And sometimes it's a multi-year giant implication that involves tech debt, that involves multiple teams, and involves real money and real loss of business value. So multiple contexts is a problem, multiple outcomes. but also you end up with a lot of unhappy people and failed projects. And this is not just my belief or my observation. This has been well documented. Here we're looking at a report from Axios about the state of internal communications, and they're actually putting a number against it for how much this ineffective communication, which is happening because people are trying to get the context they need to get work done, and how much it's actually costing them in hours and overhead. So this is just one source. There are many, many, many like this, which I'm sure you've all seen.
Yeah, I mean, this is, to interject, Henry, this is extremely interesting. I mean, the amount of conversations I have with technology leaders, and I'd love to, and perhaps after we can try and identify some more sources for people that highlight some of the cost impact, because that context piece is so important. The increase in people working in silos and in secular teams, I think being able to put a number to it is extremely powerful, and perhaps we'll get into that later into the webinar. But if I'm a technology leader sat in this position, how do I reverse engineer it back from what problems this could cause me down the line?
Yeah, I mean, these are scary numbers, particularly for someone like a CIO.
Indeed.
So we need to find a way out of this, and I think the solution is we need to find a way that we have a single source of truth, and we need to find a way to distill all of that stuff from that Rube Goldberg machine of information silos into one place and have it be distilled and sorted. And so that inspired us to create continuous coordination. And we think that there's three principles that need to guide, or three tenets that need to guide how we think about a solution like this. And that is, one, that it needs to be modern. Number two, that it's not reinventing the wheel, that we're taking all the stuff that we know works from frameworks like Agile and others, and that it's flexible, because as we all know, organizations are like fingerprints. The way that my team works is different than the way Daniel's team works, and we do standardize around things, but it's different, and people are different, and organizations are the sum of those people, and they're always different. So that's the problem that we're trying to solve. And what I did is get together with some other leaders in the remote and hybrid workspace, and try and think about how we could create something lightweight, create something that's along the same lines as the Agile manifesto, create something that's consumable and could be flexible and applied to many different kinds of organizations. And the result of that thinking was this framework called continuous coordination. And we had a lot of contributions from other folks besides myself and people within my company. We had folks from Toyota, Amazon, Fireflies, Vero, and others. They're all credited here in this position paper that we wrote to capture all of this. But the idea here is that we're trying to take what we know, what we think could be best practices, and make them consumable and applicable. So let's see here. The big idea with continuous coordination is to distill and harmonize all of the context that matters within a company or organization, so that teams can be aligned, humans can make informed decisions, and every project can be a win. That's the overall goal of what we're trying to do here. There are other implications of that, and that's why there's this little smiley face here, is because all of these things are humming. You also have engagement, you also have a morale boost. And as we all know, when we're working with developers and smart people, they don't like having their time wasted, and they don't like having a lot of bureaucracy and coordination overhead. And so if we can have some simple principles that help solve that, we're also going to solve a morale and engagement problem that's introduced by modern work. So what I'm going to do is talk about continuous coordination first in the abstract overall. And then I'm going to talk about the 7 principles of continuous coordination. So the heart of continuous coordination are these notions of async communication loops. And there's 2 of them, 2 that we like to think about in the abstract. One is a daily asynchronous communication loop. And there we're taking the best practices from Agile and from Scrum, in which people on teams communicate to each other what their intentions are, what they've done, and if they need help and they're blocked. So that is a fundamental piece of continuous coordination, a daily asynchronous communication loop. And the second loop, I said there was 2 loops. The second loop is we can call it a weekly loop, but it's really a cross-team or organization or part of an organizational or departmental communication loop. So taking what we know that works in the small loop and applying it to a larger initiative or goal. So in the larger loop, through asynchronous means in continuous coordination, we are talking about goal and project updates. We are talking about cross-team dependencies. We are talking about risk assessments in this bigger loop. So the way to think about continuous coordination is that there's these loops, and then we have principles that support the loop. The principles are really guidelines for how to make the loops work. And what I'm going to do is talk about each one of them. There's 7 principles. And the first one called keep a steady beat. So the purpose of this principle is to find the sweet spot so you're never caught on either side of the alignment trap. And what the alignment trap is on one hand, there's an easy way for a team or a company to stay aligned in a remote or an on-site context. That is to just meet 100% of the time, right? So if we all just sat on the same Zoom call all day, I guarantee we'll all be aligned. There'll be no questions about what we're doing. It's just that we won't get anything done because we're spending all our time coordinating. So that's one side of the alignment trap. And then the other side is when you don't meet at all, and you're not aligned, and you're working with multiple contexts, like I talked about in an earlier slide, and then you have people working off in the wrong direction. And we see this happen all the time. Sometimes it's working off in the wrong direction for a day, a week. We've seen whole teams work in wrong directions for months. That's a real problem. So when you're not aligned, you're going to have a problem, but you can't just meet all the time to stay aligned. And so with keep a steady beat, we are using these communication loops on a cadence to find that sweet spot for alignment. So if you remember from our previous slide, we've had these daily synchronous loops for team communication with these talking about intentions, accomplishments, and blockers. And then we have this larger loop, and that needs to be on a cadence too. So I'll just deviate for a second, say an anti-pattern that I see a lot is with goal setting, where a team or a company or a department will set some goal. Maybe it's an OKR, maybe it's a radical focus goal or SMART or an MBO or SMART goal or something like that. And everybody has a meeting, they all agree on it, and then it gets tucked into a folder of a folder of a folder in Confluence, and we never see it again. And with keep a steady beat, what we're saying is, okay, well, if you set these kind of goals, you need to review them and update them on a cadence. And that depends on the org. But most of the time with those big loops, we find that a week or a 2-week or a monthly cadence is the right one to keep a steady beat there. So that's keep a steady beat. Any questions, Daniel?
So I think what I'm interested in is how, and you touched on it there, but how do you identify that steady beat with said organization? What that will mean different things, I'm assuming, to different teams and different organizations. How do you define that originally? How do you iterate on that? And how should organizations be approaching what that optimum steady beat looks like for them? What's the process to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's, just like writing software, there's a lot of ways to address keeping a steady beat. One is a stand-up meeting. Of course, that has that doesn't cross time zones. Virtual stand-ups is a way, and I'm talking about the small loop of keeping a steady beat. The second is to use, we obviously we have a software called Steady, and Steady will push the reminders and collect this information for you on a steady beat. That's another way to do it. You can also set up automations to do it. There's a whole mix of ways to do it, but the key is to make sure that you're landing somewhere in the middle with alignment, right? So
100%.
Teams will do it differently, but with the small loop, you want to make sure that you're keeping a daily or every other day kind of cadence we recommend. And then for the larger loop, for larger initiatives, something a week or 2 weeks is probably the minimum for it to be effective.
Makes complete sense. And when you're introducing this to new people, do you see it at first as a supplement to their current ways of working, or this needs to be a change process that's managed correctly into these principles and adopted quite quickly in order to be able to see success?
Yeah, I think, well, so there's no way any team is going to make forward progress unless they're somehow solving the context problem. So there is usually something in place, and that something is usually not working. So, for example, on status meetings, that's something that could be handled async. That's small loop, keeping a steady beat on a daily basis per person. So there's usually some semblance of that, and it might be some terrible stand-up meeting that lasts 2 hours, where you go through the Jira backlog and you hit every single ticket. And replacing that with an async means is a quick win to keep a steady beat, and that way you're reserving the meeting time for actual collaborative process. I'm going to talk about meetings in a minute. And then with the larger loop, the important piece is to make sure that there is something in place so that the goals don't die of thirst, right? That the goals are continuously updated. And so that means usually adding some sort of layer on top of how you are. Every organization is setting goals. Every organization has KPIs. That is happening somehow. But what we're saying with keep a steady beat is those things need to be alive. They need to be part of the daily context. They need to be front and center for everyone in the org, or everyone who's concerned with those goals.
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
And speaking of context, the second principle is called leading with context. And we are not great software teams don't function under micromanagement, where context is just sort of top down into tasks, because like I said before, context is so important going in both directions. In order for anybody to make a decision, whether it's a developer picking a library or a manager deciding which resources to apply to which task. So, a developer is sitting on the ground with all of the context to solve a particular problem. And as we know with software, there's the issue with software is that it is subjective. Like we try and think of it as objective, but it's not. When you build software, there's an infinite ways to solve any given problem, and increasingly so with all this tech that we've got. And so to take how you solve that problem and feed it back up into the rest of the org is important, but it starts with leading with context. So if I'm a manager, if I'm a director, and I'm giving out a task, I can't just give out a task. I need to arm that person, arm the developers with the why behind the task. This is why we're doing this. This is the big loop goal that this traces back to. This is why this is important. These are the other dependencies that you might have. So leading and giving full context for managers is very important. That's what the second principle is all about.
Yeah, I think that's principle 2 for me is extremely extremely prominent. Takes me back to the infamous TED talk, Simon Sinek.
Yes. Yep.
I'm sure everybody's familiar with it. But we had a situation with a client a few years ago, large enterprise client. They were building building a suite of applications for end users, and the development team started really small. I think it was 6 people. And what they got right really early on was making that squad of developers understand the why, understand that full journey, giving that context. They had 0 paying clients for that product at the time. As I speak to you today, 3 years on, they have 30 paying clients for that product, a team of 50, continued support from C-level and the board with continual investment. And I always track that particular story back to giving that context continuously.
Right.
Great stuff, Henry.
Yeah. Okay. The third principle out of 7 is working in the open. And a few years back, Google ran a study. It was called Project Aristotle. It's been documented in several books. And what they did is spend millions of dollars and try and figure out what was the essence of high performing teams. And they looked across Google and said, what are the patterns around high performing teams? And they examined a whole bunch of things. They examined 10x developers, what the effect was with that. They examined all the perks that Google gives, foosball tables and meals and dry cleaning and all that. They took all of these factors, working hours and schedules, and what they found was that all of that stuff was meaningful, but was nowhere near as impactful as the notion of trust and transparency within teams. So with working in the open within teams and within companies, there's an important assumption there that transparency breeds trust. And again, this is something I'm not making up. This is a well-documented fact. When you have transparency, that breeds trust, and people know that they can count on each other when they know exactly what somebody else is doing and why they're doing it within the same team or within the same organization. So this principle is around eschewing information funneling and bottom up or top down information silos, and really finding ways for your org to share information and to share the why, what, and how for everyone with the work that they're doing. That's work in the open, trust and transparency. Principle 4 is called Tell the Future. And we often get in situations where we're in reactive mode with software development. We're putting out fires. We're just reacting to the hits as they come. And one of the ways around that with continuous coordination is to inject intention into those communication loops. So there's a reason why the second question in the standard agile standard question, like what do you plan on doing, is so important. And that's because it gives people the opportunity to state their intentions and to tell the future of what they're doing. And that's really important because it's there's 2 reasons that's important. One is that it's the moment where it's the least expensive time to change course before the work happens, right? So if I say, Daniel, today I plan on rewriting the TPS module, and you know that Barbara did that yesterday, you can stop me from doing that. I can work on things that are going to create value. And little examples of that add up, and whole teams with goals. That's what the larger loop is about. Injecting intention into those larger loops so that other teams might understand what another team, where they depend on what they plan on doing, and then they can look at the whole context. They can look at vision. They can look at the why behind all of the work, and inject choice, and inject decisions, and inject change requests, or things like that might save duplicative work and save work in the wrong direction. So telling the future is very important, and that's one of the key principles.
I think that ties so well into the transparency and information sharing, and showing everybody through that value chain the importance, right? So that you don't end up in that position. I love what you just said about that moment being the least costly moment. And that doesn't have to mean financially costly, but it could be a whole lot of pain for everybody involved.
Yes. And you bring up a great point. With all of these principles, there's a lot of overlap, right? They work well together. Again, with the grand scheme of things, we've got these asynchronous communication loops, but these overlapping principles work together to make those into something that's effective.
Excellent.
Okay, so this is everybody's favorite principle: spare the meetings. And I'll just say off the bat, meetings are incredibly valuable. This is where humans come together and create value and collaborate and solve problems. And they're very important. They're crucial to any team, to any organization that's particularly creating software products. So meetings are very important. What we're saying here with spare the meetings is optimize for the value creation time, because meetings are also a zero-sum game for most of unless it's collaborative. If you're having a status meeting, just like we talked about with the alignment trap, you're not working when that's happening. If you're meeting at that time, if you're spending all of your time syncing on status, you're not getting any work done. So there's a whole swath of meetings in modern work that can be moved to async, and progress updates, stand-ups, informational feedback, things like that can be moved to asynchronous communication. And that leaves room for the high value meetings with lots of people or with low headcount. But sparing the meetings is very important, and thinking about these meetings and when to rely on the communication loops, the async communication loops that we've talked about before, to communicate the status and informational stuff, and not interrupt people and gather them in a Zoom room or a physical room to have those happen is very important.
And on meetings, Henry, is there any kind of quick tips or anything practical you would recommend to optimize for meetings? I know that's a very broad question, but is there anything over your kind of years working and thinking about these principles that something's worked really well?
Yeah. Well, I think the core of this principle is to make sure you're having the right ones first. So before you get to the meeting itself, make sure you really need it. Are we really moving the needle with this meeting, or is this something we could just solve through asynchronous communication meetings? So that's step one. Yeah. And then when you're having the meeting, I am not an expert in that, but I can tell you that there's reams of information on how to make those work well. I know like Amazon has Jeff Bezos famously talks about how he ran meetings at Amazon where the presenter of the meeting, or the person who held the meeting, had to write a memo. And then you go to the meeting, everybody doesn't have their phones or computers, and you spend the first 15 minutes reading the memo. And then you have the meeting. So, I mean, that's another way to do it. And there's, again, like different things that work for different kinds of orgs. But I think the essence here is to make sure, if you're going to pull people from their lives, from value creation activities into a room, make sure that is a value creation moment.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
I think meetings is a bit of a hot topic because we've had a couple of questions. So just while we're here, if we
Sure.
stick here, so we've had a question from Xander, and Xander asks, I found that sometimes dev managers will also ignore certain stand-ups or unnecessary meetings in their view, which is necessary to align in order to ensure productivity. Is this more a workforce issue than a principle not being followed? And what is the best way to deal with these issues where you try to implement these principles, but it's not adhered to or followed, as this could also limit growth and delay projects?
Yeah.
Question. You can see that in the public chat, Henry, if you need to refer back to.
Yeah, I'm gonna go up and just
public chat from Xander.
There, I see it. Yeah, it's a great question. I think I have it on another side. We certainly say it on the continuous coordination website that one of the most important things on when you implement something like continuous coordination and when you implement any kind of framework is you need to lead by example. That is an anti-pattern if a manager isn't showing up for a stand-up meeting. Am I reading that right? That is an absolute anti-pattern. And if it's an async virtual stand-up, if they're not filling in their intentions, if they're not providing the why constantly in these loops, then they are failing as a manager, in my opinion.
Yeah, I completely agree. Henry referenced it a moment ago, but we've put the continuous coordination website link in the public chat. So if anybody's looking to take a look at that, please do. And Xander, let us know what you thought in the chat. Thanks, Henry.
Yeah, great question. I talked about Bezos before and writing the memo. That's the extreme version of this, but there is a principle we think is important here called write it down. And that's because, even as AI strips away even the act of writing is still a fundamental building block of reasoning and communication. And writing down even a sentence of my intentions makes me think about the why and why I'm doing it. So that's a very important piece of making asynchronous communication work, is to not skip the writing it down part. There's other ways that I've seen people do this with async video and things like that, but I do recommend adopting a culture of writing or encouraging a culture of writing wherever possible, because it does force someone to think about a problem in a way that they might not without writing it down. So writing is thinking is really we could call this principle writing is thinking, but if you're going to make async communication work, you got to have some semblance of good writing, or at least communicative writing to make that work.
Fantastic. Just over 5 minutes until the question and answer, everyone. So please get your questions in while you can.
So the last principle is called tracking output and not input. And I'll give a couple examples of anti-patterns to illustrate this point. So I'm sure the developers on the call will be familiar with the graph in GitHub that shows how active you are with commits at time of day or per day or per week. It's sort of, I forget what that graph is called. I don't know if you remember, Dan. It's called
I don't actually, but I hopefully someone will prompt us quickly.
Yeah, they have a name for it. I'm not doing it justice, but the reason that I don't know the name of it, because it's absolutely worthless, right? Like if I know how many commits I made per day, that's tracking an input. And actually, you think about that, I can game that a million different ways. I mean, I can actually, make 1,000 commits a day really easily with a character a piece, and make my piece of that graph dark green. And the point is that the inputs don't matter. The outputs, hitting the goals, hitting the outcomes is the thing to track. And those are the KPIs to track. Another example is I'm the administrator of my Slack workspace for my company. So I get a email from Slack at the end of every week saying, hey, here's what happened on Slack. And there'll be a little graph of the days of the week and the hours in the day. And it'll be, bigger bubbles on certain times when people are active. And I'm like, well, what does this tell me? This tells me nothing, because that's an input.
Typical,
right?
for example. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So the point is, when you're trying to measure the effectiveness of how this stuff is going, measuring productivity is notoriously hard. But one way to do it is to make sure you're looking at output and not fooling yourself with input and using false KPIs around, say, code commits or lines of code or something like that. We're software developers. We're trying to solve problems and create value and produce outcomes. So those are the 7 principles, and I'll just open it up to questions. But before I do, just talk about what we see as outcomes from using this kind of framework. And 3 in particular. One is transparency and trust, which we know is proven by science to be the key component of high-performing teams. The second is this great balance with the loops between autonomy and accountability. So you have people taking ownership over tasks, but they're also working within the greater context of the org and the value that's being created. And the last one is alignment around productivity. So people not working in the wrong direction, people using the context that they get through the loops to make the right decisions and be informed and create great software. And guess what? That also means that people are happy and they're finding purpose with their work. And that's always a key component for retention and engagement as well.
Definitely is. Definitely is. Thanks, Henry. Fantastic. We're ready to move on to some question and answers. I think Xander was complimentary of your answer, so thank you for diving a little bit deeper into that. So question 1 is, my team are under pressure to act in a return to office situation. We're spread out across the United States and Europe. I suspect the reason is a lack of visibility or misunderstanding of outputs, as you described. What can we do as a team to address that visibility problem?
Yeah, well, I think one of them, we talked about those 2 loops. There's the daily async loop, and then there's the larger loop. And usually when you're trying to demonstrate that kind of what you're doing and the outcomes you're producing, and maybe you want to demonstrate that the outcomes change if the variables change, like, oh, we went back to the office and the outcomes were the same, or they got worse or something like that. Where do you do that? And usually what we found is that small loop in continuous coordination is not the place for that. So that is team level communication, but bringing stakeholders in on the larger loop is the place where that gets where that value can be communicated and those people can understand it. And I'll just plug Steady for a sec, which is our company. But we have the notion of live goals in Steady. And what you do is you set up a large communication loop around a particular initiative. It might be a project, it might be a goal or something like that. And then you subscribe stakeholders to the updates that are happening with that loop. So, I said before that, the anti-pattern is that goals die in the folder of some wiki somewhere. But when they're seeing the loop front and center, when they're once a week are getting an update on what's happening with that particular goal, they're involved and they can see the outcomes and changes to those outcomes.
Yeah, exactly. You would have heard Henry reference Steady a few times throughout. We'll make sure that we introduce everybody at the end and show you guys all the links. We found this so important within Remobi. So obviously I mentioned at the start, we build distributed remote teams, typically for North American clients and European clients, and particularly for the Remobi squads that we're building from day one in that forming phase, having that notion of continuous coordination principles from day one. It doesn't always have to come from the top. It doesn't always have to come from leadership. You can build that foundation in from day one. So yeah, great stuff. We have another question coming in here around morale, Henry. I'll try and ask this question in the right way, and I guess this is around the change piece, which I touched on earlier, right? As we know, change can cause unrest in any setting. When it pertains to continuous coordination, how do you kind of either show that realized value as quick as possible or keep morale high whilst there's this perception of change, I guess is the best way to ask it.
Yeah, I'll see if I can answer that in a couple different ways. One of the things that I see as a big problem in modern work, and what I see as a problem in sort of clumsy attempts at async communication, like I'll pick on Slack for a second. Slack is an async communication tool, right? Like I can go put stuff into Slack right now. My team will see it maybe, but one of the problems that you have in Slack is this this feeling that you're shouting into the void, right? So Slack is an unstructured way to handle async communication, and it works for a lot of things. It works for some quick communication, but it doesn't work for the communication of these of what of either a big loop or a small loop. Because if you don't know that somebody has actually received what you said from asynchronously, that is going to have a big impact on your morale. Yeah. And I think that's, I'm answering the question correctly, but you need to set up a structure so that people who are participating in a structured communication loop don't feel like they're shouting into the wind and they're never being heard. And it sort of goes back to that dev manager who's not attending a stand-up, right? If I create a great goal update and I send it to a stakeholder and they never read it, I'm not going to create a great goal update again. I'm not going to write it down. I'm not going to work in the open. I'm not going to do all these other things. So there's a lot of pressure, I think, on leadership to live the principles alongside contributors to make continuous coordination work and have a positive impact on morale. Does that answer the question?
I think it answers it perfectly. I was trying while you were talking, particularly, I'm thinking outputs, I'm thinking transparency. How are you? And this is more a question from myself, just while we're talking about it. Are you trying to give the team the picture of the outputs for everybody as early on as possible, instead of more singular, more siloed? Is the objective that everybody understands the outputs working towards that common goal? And if so, again, is there anything you can talk to there, any way to increase that speed and efficiency with that synchronous communication?
Yeah, well, I think I talked about it before, but adding structure, keep a steady beat, some sort of structure around this communication is massive. It's huge, because then you're setting expectations for when this communication around output is happening, right? If I know that every week I'm going to get this update about this particular project or initiative, that's important. And then also making sure that the why is embedded throughout, so that the context, the reason for doing what you're doing, the reason that the outcome happened in the first place, the reason for the outputs is always present and guiding, and framing up the outcome that happened. This is why we did this, because it maps to this, it maps to this, it maps to this larger company goal.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was trying to get to. You articulated it in a brilliant way. Xander has come in with another question. I hope you can see it in the public chat. I'll read it out, but it's another substantial one. So let me get to it. When you follow the principles and adjust where needed, but at the end measuring the output reflects that there is a lack of accountability and not following along during the stages, as it's out of their comfort zone, how do you go about identifying what is causing this? And is it better to ensure the principles remain, or adapt the principles to improve the team dynamics where your team is more comfortable to operate in?
Yeah. So the second part first, continuous coordination is design. It's pretty vague. Like, we are saying structured communication loops. There's a lot of ways to interpret that. So by design, if something, it needs to be iterated and adjusted upon within your org, because like I said before, every org is different. So yes, flexibility, adjust what's not working always. To the first part of the question, continuous coordination is not designed to supplant like an agile or something like that. There are practices that good engineering teams have and good orgs have. For example, a retrospective meeting where this kind of thing would come up. And, by the way, if your org's not doing a retrospective, it should be like, that's the kind of meeting or a kind of a focal point for adjusting these kind of process things and for exploring what's working and what's not, and to absolutely change the things that aren't. But definitely, use stuff that we know works, like a retro meeting, to hone what you're doing.
Yeah, I completely agree. We have another question. If we spare the meetings, how do we know everyone is checked in and fully engaged outside of work, in inverted commas, i.e. retention ?
Yeah, well, I mean, my go-to answer is you use software designed for continuous coordination called Steady, but you need to structure the communication loops for two things. One is to collect the information, so you actually do have these. People are filling in some sort of written check-in, right, on the small loop. And the second piece is to make sure that when someone is sending that piece of structured communication, that other people know that it got absorbed and consumed, particularly by managers and leaders. So there's like a read receipt thing that needs to happen, in my opinion, with these loops.
Yeah, perfect. Makes great sense. Is there any more questions? Any more questions? Please, now is your time to submit them while you have us. We do have another one. How does continuous coordination differ from standard agile daily stand-ups, Scrum, etc., which I think we've touched on a lot throughout this, but if there's anything else, Henry, you feel like can be added to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Scrum ceremony, we'll call it the ceremony because often come that's essentially a live version of the small loop.
Yep.
So what we're saying is yes, and add some async to it, add structure to it, add a way that these, one of the common problems with a live stand-up is that it happens and everybody goes away, right? And it's ephemeral. You need a way to catalog these things and go back to it and have a way to reference the why for the work at any given time during the day. And keeping these things written down in async is a great way to do that.
Brilliant. Yeah, makes perfect sense. So that concludes our Q&A. We're going to add a quick poll here before we end, where you can let us know if there are any kind of remote team needs, or you're looking to build your own remote teams. You'd like to get to know a little bit more information about continuous coordination. I think on the next slide, Henry, you hopefully have our
oh yeah, sorry, I do.
No problem. Our socials where you can find both myself, Henry, Remobi, Steady, the continuous coordination principles. Please feel free, connect with us. Let's continue the conversations elsewhere. Is there anything else, Henry, you'd like to add?
Yeah, just one final piece, and I probably should have attached it to answer the last question. Continuous coordination is open source. It's not proprietary. There's a GitHub repository for it. It's open. Anybody can make a commit. It's under the Creative Commons license. And so you'll see in the credits that there's several people in tech who've made a lot of contributions to it. And so, yeah, we want to make it better and constantly iterate on it. So if you have ideas about ways to change it, you can get in touch with me. You can open a pull request, but it's open source. Take it and use it.
That's great. I hope people take you up on that. Look, I want to say a massive thank you, Henry. really, really enjoyed this webinar. Hopefully the attendees got some good insights. Hopefully we can continue the conversations afterwards. And yeah, thank you to everybody for joining.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Henry.